23rd of February 1945 marked the moment when Colonel Robert Barkey gripped the control stick of what would become the most devastating ground attack aircraft of World War II. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt roared beneath him, a machine the Germans had mockingly dubbed Jug or Flying Barrel for its rotund fuselage. They would soon learn to fear that barrel. The aircraft weighed 7 tons empty, more than twice the weight of its nimble cousin, the P-51 Mustang. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double wasp radial engine generated 2,000 horsepower, enough to push the stubby fighter to 428 miles per hour. But speed was never the Thunderbolt's primary virtue. This was a flying tank, built around one simple philosophy: get the pilot home alive. Barkey had flown 73 missions over occupied Europe, and he understood what separated the Thunderbolt from every other fighter in the Allied arsenal. The armor plating behind his seat was an inch thick. The engine could absorb dozens of rounds from German anti-aircraft guns and keep running. Pilots told stories of returning to base with cylinders blown off, hydraulic lines severed, and wings perforated, yet the Jug flew on. According to historical records maintained by the United States Air Force Historical Research Agency, the Thunderbolt would ultimately destroy more ground targets than any other Allied fighter aircraft during the European campaign. Between July 1944 and May 1945, a period of just 10 months, Thunderbolts operating from bases in England, France, and Belgium accounted for the destruction of approximately 86,000 enemy targets. The numbers seemed impossible. 9,000 locomotives reduced to twisted steel, 6,000 armored vehicles turned into burning hulks, 68,000 trucks obliterated on roads from Normandy to Berlin. The Flying Barrel had become the apex predator of the European theater. But on that February morning in 1945, Barkey's thoughts were not on statistics. His squadron had received orders to strike a German supply depot near Koblenz, where intelligence reported a concentration of fuel trucks supplying the Wehrmacht's crumbling western defenses. The Reich was dying, but dying armies were dangerous, especially when cornered. Barkey checked his instrument panel as his flight of 8 Thunderbolts formed up over the English Channel. Each aircraft carried 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, loaded with a combined total of 3,400 rounds of ammunition. Beneath the wings hung 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, and under the fuselage, 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs swung in their racks. The Thunderbolt was not elegant. It was not graceful. British pilots who first saw the American fighter thought it looked like a milk bottle with wings. But Barkey knew better. He had watched this aircraft absorb punishment that would have disintegrated a Spitfire or Messerschmitt. He had seen pilots nurse crippled Thunderbolts across the Channel with half their tail surfaces shot away. The Germans called it a flying barrel with contempt, but that barrel was lined with armor, packed with firepower, and piloted by men who had learned to use its strengths with devastating precision. As the French coast appeared through the morning haze, Barkey advanced his throttle and felt 8 tons of American engineering surge forward into German airspace. The story of the Thunderbolt began 3 years earlier, in 1942, when the United States Army Air Forces desperately needed a high-altitude escort fighter. Alexander Kartveli, chief engineer at Republic Aviation Corporation, had designed the aircraft around the most powerful engine available, that massive Pratt & Whitney radial that required a 4-bladed propeller 13 feet in diameter just to absorb its tremendous output. The engineering challenges were immense. The turbocharger system, essential for high-altitude performance, added weight and complexity. The ducting alone ran from the engine, back along the fuselage to the turbocharger near the tail, then forward again to the intercooler. This plumbing made the fuselage necessarily large, giving the aircraft its characteristic barrel shape that German pilots would mock and then learn to dread. First Lieutenant Mike Quirk, one of the earliest Thunderbolt pilots assigned to the 56th Fighter Group, remembered his initial reaction when he saw the aircraft at Bridgeport, Connecticut in November 1942. "We thought they'd sent us bombers by mistake," he would later recall in interviews preserved by the National Museum of the United States Air Force. The thing was enormous, compared to the P-40 Warhawks we'd been flying. Some of the boys wondered if it would even get off the ground. It got off the ground. On 8th of April, 1943, The 56th Fighter Group flew the first Thunderbolt combat mission over occupied Europe, escorting B-17 Flying Fortresses to Antwerp. The results were mixed. The Thunderbolt could reach the bombers at altitude, but German Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters proved more maneuverable in dogfights. American pilots died learning the Thunderbolt's limitations in turning combat, but they also learned its strengths. In a dive, nothing could catch a Thunderbolt. The heavy aircraft built up tremendous speed, and German fighters attempting to follow risked structural failure. In level flight at high altitude, the turbocharger gave the Thunderbolt performance that matched or exceeded its opponents. And most critically, the Thunderbolt could absorb damage that would doom lighter fighters. The transformation came in spring 1944, when Allied strategists recognized what the Thunderbolt could do at low altitude. While P-51 Mustangs took over long-range bomber escort duties, Thunderbolt groups received a new mission: armed reconnaissance and ground attack. This was the role for which the Flying Barrel was perfectly suited, and it would change the course of the air war. Colonel Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, pioneered the tactics that would make the Thunderbolt legendary. His pilots would sweep across occupied France and Germany at treetop level, hunting for targets of opportunity. The armor that made the Thunderbolt heavy also made it nearly immune to small arms fire from the ground. The 850 caliber machine guns, originally intended for aerial combat, proved devastating against locomotives, trucks, and railway cars. Documentation from the 9th Air Force compiled during the post-war period shows the evolution clearly. In the 6 months before D-Day, 6th of June, 1944, Thunderbolts destroyed approximately 1,200 ground targets while supporting the preparation for invasion. In the 6 months after D-Day, that number exploded to over 40,000 targets destroyed. The Germans noticed. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from late 1944, captured after the war, show increasing concern about what they called Jabos, short for Jagdbomber or fighter bombers. The reports specifically mentioned the P-47's resilience. One captured German anti-aircraft gunner told interrogators, "We could hit the American Thunderbolts many times, but they kept coming. It was terrible for morale." By February 1945, when Colonel Barkey led his flight toward Koblenz, the Thunderbolt had evolved from a troubled high-altitude interceptor into the most effective ground attack platform in the European theater. The Flying Barrel had found its purpose. Colonel Barkey's flight crossed into German airspace at 14,000 feet, maintaining formation while scanning the sky for enemy fighters. By February 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, but desperate men in desperate times could still kill you. Intelligence briefings warned of jet-powered Messerschmitt Me-262 aircraft operating in the area, sleek killers that could slash through a bomber formation before anyone knew they were there. But jets were rare, and fuel was rarer. The Reich's infrastructure was collapsing under relentless Allied bombing. Every gallon of aviation fuel the Germans could scrape together went to defending the industrial heartland from bomber streams. Fighter bombers at low altitude received less attention, which was exactly what made them so deadly. "Granite Leader, this is Granite 2, crackled Lieutenant Thomas Fletcher's voice over the radio. "Visual on target area, 2 o'clock low." Barkey looked down and forward. The Rhine Valley spread below them like a medieval tapestry, though one increasingly scarred by war. The city of Koblenz sat at the confluence of the Rhine and Moselle rivers, its strategic importance evident even from 3 miles up. Smoke rose from dozens of locations, some from earlier bombing raids, others from German attempts at camouflage. The supply depot intelligence had identified lay 5 miles southeast of the city, tucked into a forested area near the village of Metternich. Barkey could see it now. A roughly rectangular clearing with what appeared to be hundreds of vehicles arranged in neat rows. The Germans had attempted to cover them with camouflage netting, but it was inadequate. From altitude, the depot looked like a child's toy collection spread on a green carpet. "All Granite aircraft, this is Leader," Barkey transmitted. "We'll make 1 pass to assess defenses. 2 and 3 take the northern approach. 4 and 5 work the southern perimeter. 6 through 8, you're with me down the center. Watch for flak towers. They love to surprise us." The flight split into 3 pairs as they began their descent. This was the moment when Thunderbolt pilots earned their pay. Diving from 14,000 feet to treetop level meant entering the envelope where German anti-aircraft fire was most effective. The famous 88mm flak guns that terrorized bomber formations were less dangerous to fast-moving fighters, but the lighter 20mm and 37mm automatic cannons could shred an aircraft in seconds. At 8,000 feet, the first tracers reached toward them, green and orange streams of fire almost lazy-looking from a distance, but moving at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Barkey jinked left, then right, destroying any predictable pattern. The Thunderbolt's weight, normally a disadvantage, became an asset in these maneuvers. The aircraft's momentum carried it through evasive movements without the wallowing that lighter fighters experienced. According to combat reports filed with the 9th Air Force and now preserved in the National Archives, Thunderbolt pilots developed sophisticated tactics for ground attack missions during the final year of the war. The preferred approach was a shallow dive at 30 degrees, which balanced speed with accuracy while minimizing exposure to ground fire. Pilots would typically release bombs at 1,500 feet, then pull up while firing their machine guns at secondary targets during the climb. At 4,000 feet, Barkey could distinguish individual vehicles, trucks, fuel tankers, half-tracks, and what appeared to be several tanks undergoing maintenance. The depot was more heavily defended than intelligence had suggested. He counted at least 6 anti-aircraft positions ringing the perimeter, all firing now with increasing accuracy. Granite 3 is hit. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Richard Morrison, flying as wingman to Fletcher. Took some 20mm in the left wing, but everything's still working. This was the Thunderbolt's magic. Morrison's aircraft had absorbed cannon fire that would have disintegrated a Spitfire or Messerschmitt, yet he reported functional controls. The aircraft's designers had clustered vital systems in the heavily armored center section and distributed redundant control runs through the massive wings. You could blow 3-foot holes in a Thunderbolt's wing, and it would still fly. Roger 3, Barkey acknowledged. Make your run and climb out hard to the west. 2, stay with him. At 2,000 feet, Barkey armed his bombs and rockets. The target filled his windscreen now. He could see German personnel scrambling for cover, some manning machine guns mounted on truck beds. Muzzle flashes sparkled across the depot like deadly fireflies. 1,500 feet. Barkey's thumb found the bomb release. The Thunderbolt shuddered slightly as 2 500-pound bombs fell away, tumbling toward the fuel tankers clustered in the depot's center section. He didn't watch them fall. His eyes were already selecting targets for his guns and rockets. The flying barrel was about to show the Germans why they'd learned to fear it. The Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun was already legendary when the Thunderbolt was designed. John Browning had created it in 1918, and by World War II it had evolved into perhaps the most effective aircraft weapon in existence. Each gun fired at approximately 850 rounds per minute, and the Thunderbolt carried 8 of them, 4 mounted in each wing, staggered to fit within the structure. Colonel Barkey squeezed the trigger on his control stick and felt the familiar vibration as all 8 guns opened fire. The sound inside the cockpit was distinctive. Not quite a roar, more like a deep, rapid hammering that you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears. 3,000 rounds of ammunition had seemed like an excessive load when he'd first flown the Thunderbolt. After 73 missions, he knew it wasn't enough. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds that constituted every 5th bullet in the ammunition belt did exactly what their name suggested. Each 50 caliber round carried tremendous kinetic energy, enough to penetrate half an inch of armor plate at 200 yards. When those rounds struck a fuel truck, the results were spectacular and immediate. The first tanker Barkey's guns found exploded in a mushroom of orange flame that rose 300 feet into the air. The explosion triggered a chain reaction as burning fuel spread to adjacent vehicles. Secondary detonations rippled across the depot like dominoes falling. Black smoke boiled upward, and even at 500 feet pulling up hard from his attack run, Barkey felt the heat wash over his aircraft. Granite 6 and 7 on target now, reported Captain James Walsh. His pair of Thunderbolts swept in from the west, their guns creating visible streams of tracers that converged on a cluster of half-tracks attempting to flee the depot. The vehicles slewed sideways as 50 caliber rounds shredded their tires, punctured their fuel tanks, and killed their crews. One half-track attempted to return fire with its mounted machine gun, but a 5-inch rocket from Walsh's wingman disintegrated it in a flash of yellow flame. The historical records maintained by the United States Air Force show that the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, or HVAR, became one of the Thunderbolt's most feared weapons. Each rocket carried a 7-pound warhead moving at 1,400 feet per second, fast enough and powerful enough to penetrate the top armor of most German tanks. Thunderbolts typically carried 10 of these weapons, 5 under each wing, and pilots learned to fire them in pairs for maximum effect. Lieutenant Fletcher brought his damaged Thunderbolt through from the north, despite the 20-millimeter holes in his left wing. His bomb struck a building at the depot's edge that intelligence had identified as likely ammunition storage. The building didn't explode. It disintegrated. The blast wave was visible as a rippling distortion in the air, and debris rained down across half the depot. Something inside that building had been very volatile, possibly artillery shells or mortar rounds. "Jesus Christ," Fletcher's voice crackled over the radio. "Did you see that? There's nothing left but a crater." Barkey had already climbed to 3,000 feet, circling to assess the damage and direct his remaining pilots. The depot was thoroughly destroyed. Fires raged across every section. Vehicles that hadn't been hit directly were burning from proximity to those that had. The camouflage netting that was supposed to hide the depot had become a liability, spreading fire across the entire area like an accelerant-soaked blanket. "All Granite aircraft, reform on me at 4,000, Barkey ordered. "We're going to make one more pass to hit any vehicles attempting to exit on the southern road." This was the methodology that made the Thunderbolt so devastatingly effective. Unlike bombers that made single high-altitude passes, fighter bombers could loiter over a target area, making multiple attacks from different directions. The Thunderbolt's armor allowed it to operate at low altitude where accuracy was highest. Its tremendous ammunition capacity meant it could engage dozens of targets on a single mission. German logistics officers learned to dread daylight movement. According to captured Wehrmacht documents analyzed after the war, German army units operating in France and Western Germany during late 1944 and early 1945 reported that movement during daylight hours resulted in approximately 40% losses to Allied fighter bombers, predominantly Thunderbolts. This forced the Germans to move supplies at night, which slowed their response time and contributed to their inability to concentrate forces effectively. As Barkey's flight regrouped, he noted that all 8 Thunderbolts remained airborne despite passing through heavy anti-aircraft fire. Morrison's aircraft had taken hits, but nothing critical. 2 others showed minor damage, punctures in non-critical areas that would require patching but hadn't affected flight characteristics. "Granite 4, I'm showing 1 flak tower still active on the southern perimeter," reported Lieutenant David Chen. "Permission to suppress?" Barkey checked his fuel state. They'd burned through half their supply during the combat maneuvering and had enough remaining for 1 more attack pass and the flight home. "Granted. 4 and 5. Work that position. Everyone else, watch for targets on the access road." The second pass was less dramatic but equally deadly. The surviving flak tower fell silent after Chen and his wingman saturated it with 50 caliber fire. 3 trucks attempting to flee the depot down a narrow forest road never made it 50 yards. Barkey himself destroyed 2 staff cars that had been hidden under trees, likely officers attempting to escape before the depot was completely obliterated. When Granite Flight turned west toward friendly lines, the supply depot at Metternich no longer existed as a functional military installation. The flying barrel had struck again. Lieutenant Fletcher nursed his damaged Thunderbolt westward, watching the fuel pressure gauge with the attention of a man whose life depended on it. The 20-millimeter cannon rounds that had perforated his left wing had also damaged one of his fuel lines. Not catastrophically, but enough to create a slow leak that would matter if they encountered headwinds over the Rhine. This was the reality of ground attack flying that never made it into the newspapers or propaganda films. You didn't die in a dramatic dogfight with enemy fighters at 20,000 feet, locked in a turning battle where skill and courage determined the outcome. You died because a lucky burst of flak severed a hydraulic line, or because a fuel leak you didn't notice soon enough left you trying to glide across enemy territory, or because the damage looked manageable until it suddenly wasn't. Fletcher had flown 41 missions in the Thunderbolt. He'd started his tour flying P-40 Warhawks in North Africa during 1943, transferred to Thunderbolts in England in early 1944, and survived the meat grinder of supporting the D-Day invasion. He'd seen pilots die in dozens of ways, and the common thread was that death usually came from something mechanical rather than something heroic. "Granite 3, this is 2, came Tom Morrison's voice over the radio. "I'm showing your left wing weeping fuel, you see it?" Fletcher craned his neck to look back along his damaged wing. A thin stream of liquid, barely visible as a shimmer in the air, trailed from one of the cannon holes. The leak was slow, manageable, nothing like the catastrophic fuel fires that turned aircraft into flying torches. But it was there, and it was persistent, and every gallon he lost was one less gallon he could use to reach the emergency landing strip at Nancy in eastern France. "Roger 2, I see it," Fletcher acknowledged. "Running calculations now." The mathematics of survival. Fletcher scanned his instruments, doing the mental arithmetic that separated pilots who went home from pilots who didn't. Current fuel quantity, 140 gallons. Distance to Nancy, approximately 90 miles. Consumption rate without the leak, roughly 50 gallons per hour at cruise power. Add the leak, call it 5 gallons per hour pessimistically, and he should make Nancy with 15 or 20 gallons remaining. Enough unless something else went wrong. According to the official history of the 9th Air Force published in 1946, and based on comprehensive mission reports, Thunderbolt pilots developed an almost supernatural ability to nurse damaged aircraft home. The aircraft's ruggedness played a role, but so did pilot skill and sheer determination. Out of approximately 15,000 Thunderbolts built during the war, roughly 1/3 sustained combat damage at some point. The majority of those damaged aircraft made it home, a survival rate unprecedented in aerial warfare. Fletcher reduced his throttle slightly, leaning the mixture to maximize fuel efficiency. The Thunderbolt slowed from 280 miles per hour to 240, still faster than most fighters cruised. Speed was survival. It minimized the time you spent over enemy territory and reduced exposure to ground fire. But fuel conservation was also survival, and balancing the two required judgment that came only from experience. "Granite Leader, 3 here. I'm going to divert to Nancy rather than return to base. Should make it comfortably with fuel to spare, but no point in pushing it." "Roger 3. Colonel Barkey's voice came back immediately. 2, you go with him. Make sure he gets down safe, then continue home. Radio Nancy, and let them know you're inbound." This was why pilots loved Barkey. He didn't question, didn't second-guess, didn't demand heroic stupidity. He understood that getting your people home alive was the mission after the mission, and sometimes that meant making conservative decisions that wouldn't generate newspaper headlines. The Rhine appeared below them, its waters dark and swollen with spring runoff. This was always the critical moment, crossing the line between enemy territory and relative safety. German anti-aircraft batteries lined the eastern bank, and they didn't stop shooting just because you were leaving. Fletcher unconsciously tightened his grip on the control stick and jinked slightly left, then right, maintaining unpredictability. No flak rose to meet them. Either the batteries were unmanned, increasingly common as the Reich scraped the bottom of its manpower barrel, or the German gunners were conserving ammunition for more tempting targets. Fletcher didn't care which. He watched the river slide beneath his wings and felt a tension he hadn't known he was carrying begin to ease. "Feet wet," Morrison transmitted, using the naval aviation term that somehow felt appropriate when crossing a river this size. "Nancy Tower. This is Granite 2 and 3, approximately 40 miles east, requesting priority landing. 3 has battle damage and minimal fuel state." The tower's response came back professional and immediate. "Roger Granite 2 and 3, you're cleared for straight-in approach runway 27. Fire equipment standing by. Wind is 280 at 15 knots. Welcome home, boys." Fletcher allowed himself a slight smile. Not home yet. Still 40 miles and 15 minutes of flying time, but close enough that the mathematics had shifted in his favor. The fuel gauge showed 90 gallons remaining. The leak continued, but it hadn't worsened. The engine ran smoothly, all temperatures and pressures normal. The Thunderbolt was doing what Thunderbolts did, absorbing punishment and bringing its pilot home. Below them, eastern France rolled past. This territory had been liberated months ago, and Fletcher could see the evidence of returning normalcy. Smoke rose from farmhouse chimneys rather than bomb craters. People worked in fields, tiny figures that represented a continent slowly healing from years of mechanized slaughter. The flying barrel, for all its destructive power, was an instrument of that healing. Every depot destroyed, every supply truck obliterated, every locomotive wrecked, shortened the war by some infinitesimal amount. Fletcher believed that, had to believe it, because the alternative was confronting what they actually did. Killed people, mostly young men like themselves, who happened to wear different uniforms and speak different languages. The Nancy airfield appeared ahead, its runways marked with white paint visible from miles away. Fletcher lowered his landing gear and felt the reassuring thunk as the wheels locked down. The hydraulics still worked despite the battle damage. The fuel gauge showed 35 gallons remaining, more than he'd hoped. He touched down smoothly, the Thunderbolt's wide landing gear making it one of the most forgiving aircraft to land. As he taxied clear of the runway, Fletcher could see fire trucks following him at a discreet distance, ready to respond if the fuel leak suddenly became critical. It didn't. Engine shut down. Sudden silence after hours of constant noise. Fletcher sat in his cockpit for a moment, hands resting on his thighs, breathing deeply. 42 missions down. He needed 50 to complete his tour. 8 more missions. 8 more chances for something mechanical to go wrong at exactly the wrong moment, but not today. Today the flying barrel had brought him home again, just like it had brought home thousands of other pilots who trusted their lives to its thick armor and powerful engine. Fletcher unbuckled his harness and climbed down from the cockpit, his legs slightly unsteady as they always were after combat missions. The ground crew chief was already inspecting the cannon damage in his wing. "You got lucky, Lieutenant," the sergeant said, running his hand along the torn metal. 6 inches lower and they'd have hit your main spar. That would have been a different story. Fletcher looked at the holes and thought about those 6 inches that separated him from a catastrophic wing failure. How long to patch it? 2 days, maybe 3. We'll need to replace some structural members and fabricate new skin panels. But she'll fly again. Of course she would. Thunderbolts always flew again, that's what they did. Oberst Colonel Friedrich Hartmann stood in what remained of the Metternich supply depot and tried to comprehend the scale of destruction. He had been a logistics officer with the Wehrmacht for 12 years, had served in Poland, France, Russia, and now this final desperate defense of the fatherland itself. He had seen the results of Soviet artillery barrages, British bomber raids, and American fighter-bomber attacks. This was the worst. "Herr Oberst, the inventory team reports total loss," said Hauptmann Captain Klaus Weber, his adjutant. Weber's uniform was smudged with soot, his face gray with exhaustion, and something that might have been despair. 217 vehicles destroyed, including 43 fuel tankers. The ammunition storage facility is completely gone. The repair shops are rubble. We estimate 93 personnel killed, another 47 wounded. Hartmann walked through the devastation, boots crunching on broken glass and spent shell casings. The attack had lasted perhaps 10 minutes. 10 minutes in which 8 American P-47 Thunderbolts, those aircraft the men called Jabos, had erased a supply depot that had taken 6 weeks to establish and stock. The Reich's logistics system was already strained to the breaking point. Losses like this were becoming unsurvivable. A burned-out fuel tanker smoldered nearby. Hartmann could see where the American .50 caliber rounds had perforated its tank, neat holes grouped in clusters where the pilot's aim had been true. Fuel had sprayed from the punctures under pressure, ignited by tracer rounds or the fire from adjacent vehicles, and consumed the tanker and its crew in seconds. 2 men had been inside that cab. Hartmann had known their names that morning. Now he couldn't remember them. "The American fighter bombers are more effective than their heavy bombers," Hartmann said quietly, not really addressing Weber, just thinking aloud. The four-engined bombers drop thousands of tons of explosives on cities and industrial centers. But much of it is wasted. Random destruction. But the fighters, they see their targets, they place their weapons precisely, and they destroy exactly what matters most to our ability to fight. Weber said nothing. What was there to say? These were observations that could get a man shot for defeatism if repeated to the wrong ears, but they were also simply true. The Luftwaffe's combat reports, which Hartmann had access to through his position in Logistics Command, painted a stark picture. During the 10 months from July 1944 through April 1945, American fighter bombers, predominantly P-47s, had destroyed the transportation infrastructure that kept German armies supplied. Historical records compiled by German military authorities after the war, and now preserved in the Bundesarchiv, Federal Archives in Freiburg, show the catastrophic impact of Allied air superiority during the final year of the war. The Wehrmacht's ability to move supplies by rail declined by approximately 70% between June 1944 and March 1945, primarily due to fighter-bomber attacks on locomotives, rolling stock, and rail infrastructure. Road transport became equally hazardous, with German convoys suffering unsustainable losses during daylight movement. How long to restore operational capability? Hartmann asked, though he already knew the answer. We cannot restore it, Herr Oberst, Weber replied flatly. We lack the vehicles to replace those destroyed. We lack the fuel to supply new vehicles even if we had them. We lack the personnel to man them. We lack the air defense assets to protect them. This depot is finished. Hartmann nodded slowly. This had been one of 3 major supply depots serving the German armies attempting to hold the Rhine against American and French forces. With Metternich destroyed, the remaining 2 depots would have to absorb its workload, making them more concentrated targets that would inevitably attract similar attacks. The mathematics of collapse were straightforward once you understood them. A young soldier, perhaps 18 years old, approached hesitantly. Herr Oberst, we've recovered the bodies from the barracks. 37 men. Most of them died when the American bombs struck the ammunition storage. They never had a chance to take cover. See that they're documented properly, Hartmann ordered. Contact their units, prepare the notification letters. Do it correctly. These men deserve that much. The soldier saluted and departed. Hartmann watched him go and thought about what deserved meant in this context. These men had deserved not to die in a meaningless defense of a supply depot that couldn't change the war's outcome. They had deserved to go home to their families to rebuild the country that fanatics had driven into ruin, to live lives that weren't defined by mechanized slaughter. But deserving had nothing to do with reality. The Americans call their P-47 the Thunderbolt, Weber said, looking at the wreckage around them. Our pilots call it the Jug, or the Flying Barrel, because of its shape. They think it's ungainly, too heavy, not elegant like our fighters. But it doesn't matter what it looks like. What matters is that it keeps coming. It absorbs damage that would destroy any of our aircraft, and it kills everything it aims at. Hartmann had read the Luftwaffe reports. Experienced German pilots spoke with grudging respect about the Thunderbolt's durability. One report described hitting a P-47 with 37 20mm cannon rounds during a dogfight, hits that were visually confirmed by the German pilot's wingman. Yet the American aircraft had continued fighting and eventually escaped. The report concluded that engaging Thunderbolts below 10,000 feet was inadvisable due to their armor protection and the likelihood that they were conducting ground attack missions, meaning multiple aircraft would be operating in the area. Do we have any anti-aircraft units left operational? Hartmann asked. 2 batteries, both with critical ammunition shortages. They fired approximately 400 rounds during the attack and claimed no kills, no damage. 400 rounds? Hartmann did the arithmetic automatically. That was perhaps 30 seconds of firing from all guns combined. The Americans had been over the depot for 10 minutes, which meant the guns had fired for only 5% of the time they were under attack. Either the gun crews had been conserving ammunition or, more likely, they'd been forced to relocate constantly to avoid being targeted themselves. Very well. Have them pull back to positions covering the Rhine crossing at Andernach. There's nothing left here to defend. Weber saluted and left to deliver the orders. Hartman remained standing in the ruins of his depot, watching smoke rise from 100 fires. He thought about the American pilots who had done this. Were they celebrating now, claiming drinks in whatever officers' club they returned to? Did they think about the men they'd killed, or was it all abstract? Just targets destroyed, missions completed, points on a scoreboard? Hartman didn't hate them. He'd passed beyond hate months ago, somewhere on the retreat from Russia where hate was just another emotion the cold had frozen out of him. The Americans were doing their job, just as he was doing his. The difference was that their job was winning. Somewhere above, he heard the distinctive rumble of aircraft engines. Hartman looked up, hand reflexively shading his eyes, and saw a formation of 4-engine bombers heading east at high altitude, silver crosses in the afternoon sky. Behind them, much lower, a pair of P-47s, unmistakable by their chunky profiles, patrolled like guard dogs protecting a flock. The flying barrel, the jug, the thunderbolt. Whatever you called it, the aircraft had become the symbol of American material superiority. The Reich had built elegant fighters like the Focke-Wulf Tu-152 and revolutionary jets like the Me-262, but they were too few, too late, too starved of fuel and pilots to matter. The Americans had built thousands of Thunderbolts, ugly, heavy, brutally effective, and had the pilots, fuel, and industrial capacity to use them without restraint. Hartman turned away from the devastation and walked toward his staff car, one of the few vehicles that had survived by being parked in a dispersal area away from the main depot. He had reports to file, casualty notifications to write, explanations to provide to commanders who would be furious that he'd lost an entire depot to a handful of fighter bombers. But the Americans would come back. Tomorrow or the next day they would find another depot, another convoy, another concentration of Wehrmacht vehicles, and they would destroy it with the same methodical efficiency they'd displayed here. This was the reality of total war in 1945. Not the clash of armies on battlefields, but the systematic destruction of one side's ability to sustain its forces in the field. The flying barrel was winning this war one target at a time, and there was absolutely nothing Oberst Friedrich Hartmann could do to stop it. Technical Sergeant Anthony Moretti crawled into the left wheel well of a battle-damaged Thunderbolt and swore creatively in English, Italian, and a hybrid language that belonged exclusively to aircraft mechanics. The 20mm cannon round had punched through the wheel door, ricocheted off the landing gear strut, leaving a deep groove in the steel but miraculously not severing it, and embedded itself in the hydraulic manifold. Hydraulic fluid had sprayed throughout the wheel well before the pilot managed to ISIL, ate the damaged system and switched to the backup. The entire compartment looked like someone had painted it with reddish fluid, and the smell of MIL H5606 hydraulic fluid made Moretti's eyes water. "How bad is it, Sarge?" asked Corporal Jimmy Patterson, holding a work light at the wheel well's entrance. "Bad enough that I'm questioning my life choices," Moretti replied, his voice muffled by the confined space. "We're going to need a new hydraulic manifold, complete brake line replacement, new wheel well door, and about 6 hours of cleaning before we even start reassembly. Tell Lieutenant Fletcher his bird won't fly for at least 3 days." This was the hidden reality of the Thunderbolt's war. For every hour an aircraft spent in combat, ground crews spent anywhere from 20 to 50 hours maintaining it. The mechanics who kept the flying barrels operational were as essential to the 9th Air Force's devastating ground attack campaign as the pilots who flew them. Yet their stories rarely made it into the official histories. Moretti had been maintaining aircraft since 1941, starting with P-40 Warhawks at a training base in Arizona. He'd worked on Thunderbolts since early 1944 and had become intimately familiar with every system, every weakness, every jury-rigged solution that kept damaged aircraft flying. He'd seen Thunderbolts return to base with damage that should have been fatal. Entire tail sections held together with cables and prayers, wings with 3-foot sections missing, engines with multiple cylinders blown off still somehow generating enough power to limp home. The Thunderbolt was built to absorb punishment, but somebody had to repair that punishment before the aircraft could fight again. That was where Moretti and thousands of mechanics like him entered the equation. "Patterson, get me the parts manual and start pulling everything we'll need from supply," Moretti ordered. extracting himself from the wheel well with difficulty. His uniform was soaked with hydraulic fluid, his hands were cut from sharp metal edges, and his back ached from working in cramped positions. "We're going to be here all night." According to maintenance records preserved by the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, the typical Thunderbolt required approximately 30 man-hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time during combat operations. This included routine maintenance like oil changes and inspections, plus the additional work required to repair combat damage. Ground crews at forward airfields in France and Belgium during late 1944 and early 1945 typically worked 12 to 16-hour days to keep their aircraft operational. The 9th Air Force operated approximately 15 fighter groups equipped with Thunderbolts during the final year of the war. Each group contained roughly 75 aircraft, which meant approximately 1,100 Thunderbolts were operating from bases in France, Belgium, and eventually Germany itself. Keeping those aircraft flying required a logistics and maintenance infrastructure that rivaled anything in military history. Moretti walked across the hard stand toward the maintenance hangar, mentally cataloging the work ahead. The manifold replacement was straightforward if time-consuming. Disconnect the damaged component, install the new one, reconnect all the hydraulic lines, bleed the system, test for leaks. The brake lines were more complex because they ran through the landing gear strut, which meant partially disassembling the gear to access them. The wheel well door could be fabricated from sheet aluminum if supply didn't have a replacement, though that added another day to the repair timeline. "Sarge, we've got a problem," called Sergeant Willis from across the flight line. "Number 4 bird just taxied in with engine trouble. Pilot says the number 3 cylinder is missing, and the oil pressure is dropping." Moretti changed direction toward the troubled aircraft. A missing cylinder meant catastrophic engine damage. Either the cylinder head had blown off due to detonation, or a connecting rod had failed and punched through the crankcase. Either way, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine would need replacement, which was a 24-hour job minimum with a full crew. The Thunderbolt sat on the hardstand, engine ticking as it cooled, a visible oil leak spreading beneath the cowling. The pilot, a first lieutenant Moretti didn't recognize, climbed down from the cockpit looking shaken. "She started running rough about 10 miles out," the pilot explained. "Then there was this bang like somebody fired a gun inside the engine, and the whole aircraft vibrated like it was tearing itself apart. I pulled power back immediately and nursed her home. Think I hurt her bad?" Moretti walked around to the right side of the aircraft and opened the cowling access panels. The R2800 was a radial engine with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows of 9. Cylinder number 3 in the forward row was catastrophically damaged. The cylinder head had separated from the barrel, probably due to detonation from poor quality fuel or incorrect mixture settings. The connecting rod was still attached and hadn't punched through the crankcase, which was good news. The bad news was that the separated cylinder head had damaged adjacent cylinders before being ejected through the cowling. "You made the right call pulling power back immediately," Moretti told the pilot. "Probably saved the whole engine. As it is, we're looking at engine replacement. 3 days minimum, more likely 4. The pilot's face fell. "My squadron commander is going to kill me. We're already short on operational aircraft. Not your fault, Lieutenant. This bird has..." Moretti checked the maintenance logbook hanging in its pouch near the cockpit. 630 hours on this engine. Recommended overhaul is 500 hours. She was overdue and running on borrowed time. You didn't break her, she broke herself. This was another hidden aspect of the air war that never made it into newspapers. The 9th Air Force was flying combat operations at a tempo that exceeded every maintenance schedule and recommendation. Engines that should have been overhauled every 500 hours were running 700, 800 hours before replacement. Airframes that required major inspections every 200 hours were stretching to 300. Tires, brakes, propellers, instruments, everything was being pushed beyond design limits because the demand for operational aircraft exceeded the supply of replacement parts and maintenance time. The result was that Thunderbolts were literally wearing out faster than they could be maintained. According to post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the 9th Air Force lost more aircraft to accidents and mechanical failures during the final 6 months of the war than to enemy action. Exhausted pilots flying exhausted aircraft from hastily prepared forward airfields created conditions where something mechanical was always on the verge of failing. But somehow the system worked. Moretti and thousands of mechanics like him worked through the nights, cannibalizing parts from damaged aircraft to keep others flying, improvising repairs that would have horrified the engineers at Republic Aviation, but which kept Thunderbolts operational. The flying barrels kept flying because the ground crews refused to let them stop. "Willis, get an engine hoist over here and start prepping for engine change," Moretti called. "Patterson, when you finish pulling parts for Fletcher's bird, I need you to coordinate with supply for a replacement R2800. Tell them it's priority 1. We need it by tomorrow morning." The sun was setting over the airfield, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Moretti of the fuel fires he'd watched from a distance when attacks went wrong. The day shift mechanics were finishing their work, but the night shift was already arriving. Maintenance never stopped. The war never stopped. The Thunderbolts had to fly tomorrow, which meant the mechanics had to work tonight. Moretti lit a cigarette, against regulations on the flight line but universally ignored, and surveyed his domain. 15 Thunderbolts sat on hard stands in various states of repair. 3 were fully operational and would fly tomorrow's missions. 4 were undergoing routine maintenance and would be ready within 24 hours. 8 had varying degrees of combat damage that would take anywhere from 2 days to 2 weeks to repair. And scattered around the airfield's perimeter were perhaps a dozen Thunderbolts too damaged to repair economically. Aircraft that would be stripped for parts and eventually scrapped. This was what victory looked like from ground level. Not the dramatic combat footage or the newspaper headlines about targets destroyed, but the endless cycle of repair, maintenance, improvisation, and sheer stubborn determination that kept damaged aircraft flying into combat again and again. "Sarge, supply says they don't have a replacement engine available," Patterson reported, jogging back from the supply depot. "Next shipment isn't scheduled until 3 days from now." Moretti took a long drag on his cigarette and considered his options. "Find Captain Reynolds and tell him we need authorization to pull the engine from bird number 17, the one with wing spar damage. That aircraft won't be ready for 2 weeks anyway, so we'll cannibalize her engine for number 4. Patterson nodded and departed. This was standard procedure now, robbing Peter to pay Paul, keeping some aircraft flying by sacrificing others. The mathematics of attrition applied to maintenance as much as combat. Every day, more Thunderbolts were damaged than could be fully repaired. The only thing preventing complete collapse of operational capability was that the war was ending. Germany was dying. Soon, maybe weeks, maybe months, the shooting would stop, and the mechanics could finally catch up on all the deferred maintenance, all the improvised repairs, all the aircraft that were held together with wire and determination. But until then, Moretti and his crews would work through the nights, keeping the flying barrels flying, maintaining the aircraft that were systematically destroying Germany's ability to continue fighting. The pilots got the medals and the newspaper coverage, but the mechanics were the reason those pilots made it into the air. Moretti finished his cigarette, crushed it under his boot, and headed back toward the hangar. He had a long night ahead of him, and Lieutenant Fletcher's Thunderbolt wasn't going to repair itself. 8th of May, 1945 arrived with a peculiar silence that Colonel Barkey found more unsettling than comforting. His Thunderbolt sat on the hard stand at a forward airfield in Bavaria, fully fueled and armed, but with no mission briefing scheduled. The war in Europe had officially ended at 23:01 hours the previous night, and the sudden absence of purpose left a hollow feeling that Barkey suspected he'd be carrying for a long time. He climbed into his Thunderbolt's cockpit anyway. His aircraft, the one he'd flown for the last 73 missions, the one that bore his name stenciled below the canopy along with 73 small bomb symbols representing ground attack missions. The leather seat felt familiar. The control stick fit his hand perfectly. The instrument panel was as comfortable as his own bedroom. This aircraft had become an extension of his body over the past 14 months of combat operations. But now what? The shooting had stopped. The targets were gone. The flying barrel had nothing left to destroy. "Figured I'd find you here," said Major Tom Fletcher, climbing up on the wing. Fletcher had completed his 50th mission 3 weeks earlier, but had volunteered to stay with the squadron through the end. "Can't quite believe it's over, can you?" "Should be relieved," Barkey replied. "Should be celebrating." Instead, I'm sitting in my cockpit wondering what I'm supposed to do with myself now. Fletcher nodded, understanding. They'd both been at war for so long that peace felt like a foreign country whose language they didn't speak. The transition from combat operations to peacetime garrison duty would be jarring, perhaps impossible for some. Barkey had already heard rumors of pilots requesting immediate discharge, unable to imagine themselves doing anything other than flying combat missions. 9th Air Force released preliminary statistics this morning, Fletcher said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. Thought you'd want to see them. These are just for the period from July 1944 through yesterday. 10 months total. Barkey took the paper and read the numbers in the morning light. The statistics were staggering, almost incomprehensible in their magnitude. According to the 9th Air Force's compiled mission reports, Thunderbolt groups operating in the European theater of operations had destroyed 9,121 locomotives, 6,847 armored vehicles including tanks, half-tracks, and armored cars, 68,409 trucks and transport vehicles, 3,036 rail cars, 409 bridges, 962 anti-aircraft positions, 1,843 artillery pieces, and 647 aircraft destroyed on the ground. The total came to approximately 86,000 targets destroyed in 10 months of operations. Historical records compiled by the United States Air Force Historical Research Agency and later verified through cross-referencing with German military archives confirm these numbers as reasonably accurate, though some historians argue they may undercount actual destruction by 10 to 15% due to conservative reporting standards. 86,000 targets, Barkey said quietly. That's almost 300 targets destroyed every single day for 10 months straight. The Germans never had a chance once we achieved air superiority, Fletcher observed. They couldn't move supplies during daylight. They couldn't concentrate forces for counterattacks. They couldn't repair their rail system faster than we destroyed it. We didn't beat them in any single decisive battle. We just ground them down target by target until they had nothing left to fight with. Barkey thought about Oberst Hartmann, the German logistics officer whose name he'd never know, standing in the ruins of the Metternich depot. He thought about the German soldiers who'd died in burning trucks, crushed under collapsing buildings, caught in the open by thunderbolts that appeared without warning. The numbers on the paper Fletcher had handed him represented thousands of individual deaths, each one a person with a name and a family and a life that had been erased in seconds of .50 caliber fire or high explosive detonation. Do you think we'll be remembered for this? Barkey asked. Or will history focus on the bomber crews and the invasion forces while we're just a footnote? Fletcher considered the question. Honestly, I think most people won't understand what we did. Ground attack flying isn't glamorous. We didn't fight dramatic dogfights with enemy aces. We destroyed trucks and trains and supply depots. It's not the stuff of legend. But it won the war. Fletcher agreed. The Germans couldn't fight without supplies, and we destroyed their ability to deliver those supplies. Everything else, the bomber offensive, the ground advances, the final collapse, all of that was possible because we cut the German military's logistics lifeline. The Flying Barrel may not be remembered as the most famous aircraft of the war, but it was probably the most effective. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine that powered the Thunderbolt produced 2,000 horsepower and was one of the most reliable aircraft engines ever built. The 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns carried 3,400 rounds of ammunition collectively and could fire for approximately 30 seconds of continuous shooting. The armor protection that gave the Thunderbolt its characteristic bulk consisted of steel plates up to 1 inch thick protecting the pilot and critical systems. These specifications, derived from the technical manuals preserved by the National Museum of the United States Air Force, explained why the Thunderbolt could operate at low altitude in heavily defended areas and survive damage that would destroy other aircraft. But specifications didn't capture what the aircraft actually meant to the pilots who flew it. The Thunderbolt represented survival. It represented the ability to deliver devastating firepower and still make it home to fight another day. It represented American industrial capacity, translated into a weapon system that could be produced in sufficient numbers to achieve overwhelming superiority. 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts were built during World War II, more than any other Allied fighter except the Soviet Yak series. Of those 15,000, approximately 3,742 were lost in combat or accidents during the war. That meant roughly 75% of all Thunderbolts built survived the war, a remarkable statistic given the intensive combat operations they conducted. What happens to them now? Barkey wondered aloud, gesturing at the rows of Thunderbolts parked across the airfield. What does the Air Force do with 15,000 fighters when there's no one left to fight? Scrap most of them, I'd guess, Fletcher replied. Maybe keep a few hundred for occupation duties and training. The rest will be cut up for raw materials. There's a rumor that some will be sold to foreign air forces, but I don't know if that's true. The thought of these magnificent aircraft being reduced to scrap metal felt wrong somehow. These weren't just machines. They were partners that had kept their pilots alive through impossible situations. Barkey knew his emotional attachment was irrational, but he couldn't help feeling that the Thunderbolts deserved better than a cutting torch and a smelter. Come on, Fletcher said, jumping down from the wing. Squadron's having an unofficial gathering at the officers' club. Just the pilots who flew the whole campaign, you should be there. Barkey took one last look around his cockpit, letting his hand rest on the control stick for a moment. Then he climbed down and walked with Fletcher toward the distant building where pilots were already gathering. Behind them, the flight line full of Thunderbolts sat silent in the morning sun, their war finally over. The mathematics of the air war told a story that most civilians would never fully understand. The strategic bombing campaign against German industry received the attention and the documentary coverage. But the systematic destruction of German logistics by fighter bombers like the Thunderbolt was equally important to Allied victory. Every locomotive destroyed meant supplies that couldn't reach the front. Every truck obliterated meant troops that couldn't be moved to threatened sectors. Every fuel tanker burning meant fighters that couldn't fly and tanks that couldn't attack. The flying barrel had earned its mocking nickname from German pilots who thought it looked ungainly and heavy. But those same German pilots learned to avoid engaging Thunderbolts at low altitude, and German ground forces learned to dread the distinctive sound of Pratt & Whitney radial engines approaching at treetop level. The aircraft that looked like a barrel proved to be one of the most effective weapons in the Allied arsenal. Years later, historians would analyze the air war over Europe and debate the relative effectiveness of different aircraft types and different strategies. Some would argue that the strategic bombing campaign was decisive. Others would claim that achieving air superiority over the battlefield was the key factor. But those who looked carefully at the data would recognize that the systematic destruction of German logistics by aircraft, like the Thunderbolt, created conditions where Germany simply could not sustain military operations regardless of how many troops or tanks they still possessed. 86,000 targets destroyed in 10 months, 9,000 locomotives that would never deliver ammunition to the front, 68,000 trucks that would never carry supplies to threatened positions, 6,000 armored vehicles eliminated before they could reach the battlefield. These were the numbers that explained German collapse as much as the dramatic advances by Allied ground forces or the devastating bombing raids on German cities. Colonel Robert Barkey never flew the Thunderbolt in combat again. He remained in the Air Force after the war, eventually retiring as a brigadier general in 1967. In interviews late in his life, he always spoke with respect, bordering on affection about the aircraft that had kept him alive through 73 missions over heavily defended territory. It wasn't pretty, he would say, but it brought me home every single time. You can't ask more from an aircraft than that. The Thunderbolt's war ended on 8th of May 1945, but its legacy continued. The lessons learned from its design, the importance of pilot protection, the value of heavy armament, the effectiveness of ground attack operations, influenced aircraft design for decades afterward. Modern close air support aircraft trace their lineage directly back to the Thunderbolt's pioneering work in combining durability, firepower, and precision attack capability. The Germans called it a flying barrel with contempt. The pilots who flew it called it the jug with affection. History should remember it as one of the most effective weapons of World War II, an ungainly-looking aircraft that destroyed 86,000 targets in 10 months and helped bring a devastating war to its conclusion. The sun rose higher over the Bavarian airfield where Barkey's Thunderbolt sat silent. The war was over. The flying barrel had done its job. Somewhere in the distance, pilots gathered to celebrate survival and mourn friends who hadn't made it. The mathematics of victory were written in the destroyed targets, the survived missions, and the quiet mourning that meant no more pilots would die in burning aircraft. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt had earned its place in history, one target at a time, through 10 months of relentless combat operations that systematically dismantled German military logistics. It was never the most famous fighter of World War II, never captured public imagination the way Spitfires and Mustangs did. But it was, by any objective measure, one of the most effective, a flying barrel lined with armor, packed with devastating firepower, and piloted by men who learned to trust their lives to its rugged construction. That trust was repaid in survival rates that exceeded any comparable aircraft. The flying barrel brought its pilots home, and in doing so, helped bring the war home to a conclusion that had seemed impossible just years earlier. History would remember many weapons from World War II, but few combined effectiveness, durability, and sheer destructive capability as successfully as the aircraft the Germans learned to fear. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the flying barrel that destroyed 86,000 targets and helped win a war.